Hello and welcome to the Profitable Baker podcast, the show for bakers who mean business. I'm Annie Bennett, founder of the Home Baking Business Academy, and every week I'll be sharing practical lessons, mindset shifts, and inspiring stories from bakers who are building businesses they love. Because success in this industry isn't about who bakes the fanciest cakes, it's about who builds the strongest business foundations. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Profitable Baker podcast with me, Annie Bennett. Now, if you've been following along with the last few episodes, you'll know I've been deep in finance territory this month. Expenses, record keeping, making tax digital, national insurance. It's been a bit of a theme. And today I want to bring it all together with the topic that I think sits underneath all of it. The thing that's really going on when a baker tells me they're not great with the financial side. The thing that explains why someone who can flawlessly execute a 6-tier celebration cake goes slightly cold at the mention of two words: self-assessment. Now, I want to be honest with you from the start. When I say self-assessment doesn't have to be scary, I'm not about to tell you that it's fun. It's not fun. Filing your tax return isn't a hobby. Nobody sits down on a Saturday afternoon with a cup of tea and thinks, oh, I know what would be lovely right now. But scary? I genuinely don't think it deserves that reputation. I think the fear around it is doing real harm. Not dramatic, obvious harm, but the quiet kind. The kind that makes bakers put off registering, put off looking at their numbers, put off building the habits that would make the whole thing straightforward. So today I want to talk about where the fear actually comes from, and then I'm going to dismantle it piece by piece. So let me ask you something. Have you ever actually sat down with someone who's filed a self-assessment tax return and found it deeply traumatic? Not stressful, I said traumatic, and not annoying. I mean genuinely, fundamentally frightening. Now, most people haven't, because for most sole traders, once it's actually done, the overwhelming feeling is not fear, it's relief. Sometimes a little bit of irritation, occasionally surprise in either direction about the number at the end, but mostly it's just relief that it's over and a vague sense that it wasn't quite as bad as they'd been dreading. So where does the dread come from if it rarely matches the reality? I think there are a few things at play here, and I think it's worth naming them properly, because once you can see what's driving the feeling, it loses some of its power. Okay, the first thing. Self-assessment sounds more complicated than it is. The name doesn't help. Assessment is a word we associate with being judged, being tested, being found wanting. It has school exam energy. And the self bit somehow makes it worse, like you're being left alone with the exam paper and told to get on with it, with no teacher to ask and no one to check you're working. But here's what self-assessment actually is. It's a form, an online form, and in most cases with prompts and guidance notes built in. You put your numbers in the boxes, the system does the calculation. You review the number it produces, you pay it. And that's the basic shape of it. Now, I'm not pretending there's no nuance. I love that word. There is nuance. The questions about whether you're employed as well as self-employed, whether you have other income sources, whether you need to declare things beyond your baking business, those add a bit of complexity. And for some people, getting an accountant involved genuinely is the right call. But for a home baker whose sole trade income is their only self-employment income with no particularly complicated tax situation, the form is more manageable than the name suggests, and the fear is often much bigger than the form. Now, the second thing, and this is quite a big one, is that the fear is really about the unknown, not the form itself, the number at the end. Because for a lot of home bakers, This is when they first find out what they owe. They haven't been tracking their income particularly carefully throughout the year. They haven't had a clear sense of what their profit looks like. And so they sit down to file their return, genuinely not knowing whether the bill at the end is going to be 200 or 2000. And that's frightening. That uncertainty is stressful. And I want to acknowledge that because I don't want to be dismissive of it. But, and this is important, the fear in that scenario isn't actually about self-assessment. It's about not knowing your numbers. Self-assessment is just the moment when the unknown becomes known. It's the messenger. And we've been blaming it for the message. If you know your income throughout the year, if you've been recording it, if you have a rough sense of your profit, then the number at the end of your tax return isn't a surprise. Now, it may not be a number you enjoy paying, but it isn't a shock. And there's a vast difference between this is a large bill and this is a large bill I didn't know was coming. That's why the record keeping we talked about in previous episodes isn't just about compliance, it's about replacing fear with information. And information, even when it's uncomfortable, is always less frightening than uncertainty. Now, the third thing is what I like to call the getting it wrong fear. And I think this one is particularly common amongst conscientious people, which in my experience, most home bakers are. It's the worry that you'll make a mistake, that you'll misunderstand something, that you'll claim something you shouldn't have or miss something you should have included, and the HMRC will come after you for it. Now, I want to address this one directly because I think it's causing a lot of unnecessary anxiety. Mistakes on self-assessment tax returns happen. They happen to people who do their own returns. They happen to people who use accountants. The HMRC knows this. The system is not designed to catch you out for honest errors. It's designed to collect the right amount of tax from the right people. And it has processes for querying, correcting, and amending returns when things aren't right. If you make a genuine mistake and realise it, you can amend your return. The HMRC allows you to make corrections online within a certain window. If the HMRC spots something they want to query, they open an inquiry, which sounds alarming, but for most people with straightforward business affairs, it's more of a conversation. What the HMRC is actually looking for is deliberate, persistent dishonesty, not a baker who wasn't sure whether a particular expense was claimable and decided to include it. Does that mean you should be careless? Of course it doesn't. No, you should do your honest best, keep your records, and if you're genuinely unsure about something, find out before you file rather than guessing. But the standard you're being held to is your honest, reasonable best, not perfection. The fourth thing, and I think this is more common than people admit, is that self-assessment feels like proof of something, not just a tax return, a verdict. When you sit down to file, you're confronted with the actual numbers from your business, your actual turnover, your actual profit. And for bakers who aren't confident about their pricing, who worry they're not charging enough, who have a nagging sense they should be doing better, sometimes the fear isn't really about the tax at all. It's about finding out definitively what the business looks like on paper. And if they're not sure they like what they'll see, there can be a very human instinct to just not look. I understand that instinct completely, but you need to gently push back on it because the numbers, whatever they are not a verdict on your worth as a baker or a business owner. They are information. They are the starting point for making better decisions. They are not a judgment. And the bakers who genuinely thrive, the ones who build sustainable, profitable businesses, they're not the ones with the most impressive figures. They're the ones who look at their numbers honestly, understand what they mean, and use that understanding to improve. You can't do any of that if you're avoiding the data. So let's spend a moment looking through what actually happens when you file a self-assessment return, because I think demystifying the actual process is useful. You file online through the HMRC's website through your government gateway account. If you're not yet registered, you need to do that in advance. And you need to do that by the 5th of October, but don't leave it too late because the HMRC sends you an activation code by post, which takes a few days. So it's not something to leave to the last minute. Once you're in, the return itself guides you through the sections. There's a section for your personal details, a section for your employment income, if you have any, a section for your self-employment income, and this is where your baking business figures go. For your self-employment, you'll be asked for your turnover, your total income from the business before expenses. Then your allowable expenses. And unless your turnover is over 90k, you only need a total figure, not break it down into categories. Now, the difference between those two figures is your profit, and that is the number your tax is calculated on. The form then asks about any other income, so savings, dividends, rental income, any of that. If none of that applies, you can skip it, and then it calculates what you owe. In fact, the first part of the form where they gather the information, whatever you tick on that will then dictate which forms they give you. So you don't see all the possible forms on a self-assessment. They only give you the ones that you need to fill out. Then what happens is once you put all your numbers in, the form then calculates what you owe. And from that calculation, two things come out. Your income tax, which is based on your profit above the personal allowance, and your national insurance contributions. Class 4, which is a percentage of your profit, and Class 2, if that applies to your situation. And then there's payments on account. Now, these are things that nobody warns you about. And then the first time you see them on your tax bill, they can feel like a nasty shock. If you want to know more about payments on account, listen to episode 21 as I explain them in detail in there. So let me come back to the title of this episode. Self-assessment doesn't have to be scary. I've been trying to unpick where the fear comes from, the complicated name, the uncertainty about numbers, the worry about getting it wrong, the avoidance that comes from not wanting to see the data. And I hope I've made the case that most of these fears are, at their root, about something other than the self-assessment itself. The complexity that feels overwhelming is mostly navigable, especially for straightforward businesses. The fear of an unexpected number goes away when you know your numbers throughout the year. The worry about mistakes is rooted in a misunderstanding of what the HMRC is actually looking for. And the avoidance of data, now that is a feeling I understand, but it's one that can cost you more the longer you indulge it. Self-assessment is a form, an annual form that asks you to account for your business income. It sits at the end of a year of earning and spending and running your business. And if you've been keeping decent records, if you know your figures, it's not an ordeal. It's an afternoon. Yeah, not particularly fun afternoon, but an afternoon. Now, before I close, I want to say something that I think is worth saying directly. If you are someone who's been putting this off, who's been vaguely aware that you probably need to sort his tax situation out, but hasn't quite got there yet, I want you to know that you are not unusual. You are not uniquely disorganized. You are not behind in a way that can't be caught up with. The home baking world is full of skilled, hardworking people who are brilliant at what they do and find the business and financial side genuinely difficult. Not because they're not capable of it, they absolutely are, but because no one taught them. And because running a small business from home while juggling everything else life involves is genuinely a lot. Now, the goal of this series, and honestly, of everything I do in the academy, has never been to make you feel like you should already know what you've never been taught. It's to give you that knowledge in a way that's accessible and honest so you can make good decisions and feel genuinely confident about your business. Self-assessment is part of running a legitimate business, and running a legitimate business is something to be proud of, not frightened of. Now, if this episode or any of the other episodes in the series has left you thinking, right, I actually need to get on top of this properly, then I would love to see you inside the Home Baking Business Academy membership. Our finance month content covers all of this in depth: expenses, record keeping, tax changes, national insurance, payments on account, and a full step-by-step self-assessment walkthrough designed specifically for home bakers. Content that's been built around the way a real baking business actually works. If you're interested in the membership, the details are in the show notes. And if this series has been useful to you, please do share it with other home bakers who you think might need to hear it. There are a lot of bakers out there who are quietly worrying about exactly these things, and sometimes just hearing someone explain it calmly makes an enormous difference. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Take care of yourselves, take care of your businesses, and I'll see you next time.